Okay, so I had some people come up to me and say, please speak more slowly. That's the end of the talk. The reason I speak English is because I actually come from Canada, and even though I've been here for a while, if I'm going to teach, especially Dharma, I'd rather struggle with the Dharma than with the language. So that's what I'm doing now. And I first started training this is the hidden biography. I first started training in a Zen monastery about 1989 in Montreal Zen Center. And it was difficult. So I thought I'd try something else, and I went to Thailand and lived in the forest tradition there for a little while, and that was way too difficult. So I looked for something I thought would be easier, and I went. I trained in Nepal for a little bit, and that was also too difficult. So I ended back in the Zen monastery, and it was too difficult. But it was a difficulty I knew. So there's this motion of leaving yourself and coming back to yourself, and coming back to it from a different perspective. One time when I was in the Berkeley Zen Center, I was having a talk with the abbot, Mel Weinstein. He'd been practicing for 40 years at that time I was there, and I asked him, I said, something, of course, dumb. I said, oh, meditation must be really easy for you now. Like 40 years would make it really easy. He said, no. I just know what to expect. So, the difficulty, it's still difficult, but I know there's difficulties. So, in a sense, letting go of the self, or being more selfless, is actually engaging and understanding and encountering the self more and more. And this is where I'm going to lead into. I'm bringing some writings of Master Dogen, and this is sort of what he talks about a lot. And he's been my kind of guide for a while now. Especially his main piece called Genjokwan, or Actualizing the Fundamental Point. And he talks a lot about this self as the focus that we go through. Wherever you're going, whatever you're doing, that's what you're encountering. So you may hear a noise outside, and you're aware of the noise, but you're aware of being aware of the noise, and you're aware of your reaction to that noise, that I don't like it because it's disturbing my quiet. What you're encountering again and again is yourself. And so the more you practice, the more you're actually encountering the self in everything. And by encountering the self in other things, you see that the self is a lot of non-self. Right? There's myself in the glass of water, I like it, or there's myself in the sunshine, it's too hot. Myself is all over the place. There's a lot of non-self and self. Now, I want to get to just a background of Dogen. He was the founder of Soto Zen in Japan. He lived from the year 1200 to 1253, and he was born in Kyoto, and he was born to a lot of privilege, but he lost his father at age 3 and his mother at 8, and he was supposed to inherit that privilege, but he chose instead to go to a monastery. He ordained at the age of 13. But at some point after studying for a while and practicing for a while, he came to this question that's written in his biography, and I want to share it with you. It's a question that I think is still relevant all the time. He said, all the teachings explain that a person in essence has true Dharma and is originally a Buddha nature. If so, why do all the Buddhas of past, present, and future arouse the wish for and seek enlightenment? I want to translate that into more simple language. If the teachings tell us, and the Mahayana teachings tell us, that every sentient being has Buddha nature, meaning you're all naturally enlightened. So then, why do we have to practice? Like, why do we have to do meditation or come to a talk like this or study or buy books and go on retreats? Why do I have to do anything if I'm naturally enlightened? If I have Buddha nature, shouldn't it just be apparent? Shouldn't I just be wherever all the time? Shouldn't I be free and enlightened right now? What's the point? And he didn't find an answer in Japan at the time, so he spent a few years in China. He went to China to practice. And he also didn't find it so much there until pretty much the end of his journey. At one point, it was like this little aside. He was offered Dharma transmission in China from one of the main monasteries. He was offered to get sort of acknowledgement that he was awakened. And it says, and he politely refused. And he came back to Japan, and at the age of 27, then he had a deep realization in China, and then he came back to Japan, and in 1233 he wrote the main text, the Genjokan, that I want to talk about. And the question of, if we're naturally enlightened, why do we need to practice, can also be asked in a different way if we turn it around. If I'm naturally enlightened, then why is it that I just don't feel it? I don't realize it. Why is it that I can have a great meditation, I can go outside, a bird can shit on my new shirt, and I look up and say, why me? Or I get really bothered by the honking horns on the streets. And I just had a moment of freedom in this meditation. So where did that go? So the question can be looked at from both directions. So if we have this natural selflessness and openness and freedom, then how come it disappears in the next moment? And I'm stuck with my small self and all of its, concerns and pettiness, and you know yourself better than I do, and I know myself, and I know what I'm dealing with, and it's all the time, except for these little moments. So if I have Buddha nature, then why is that? It really bothered me when I started practicing. It bothered me that the teachings were so grand and wide and wonderful, so liberating, but my experience of them wasn't. That I would have this teaching that there's this great mind and awareness, emptiness and freedom, there's liberation. If that's the truth, if the truth really is that I have Buddha nature, and that's so much bigger than my small self, then how can my small self cover up that bigness? That seems it should be the other way around. That it totally, obliterates that small self, or totally makes it not a problem. But that hasn't been my experience. My experience has been one that, again and again, that small self asserts itself and overshadows the big self, the enlightened self, the aware self. And that's a sort of a terrible mystery. The Zen way, at least some of the way that I've been taught, some of the phrases have been that, it's the practicing the great question of life and death. And the more we look into these questions, the more the questions become simply the way we breathe and the way we live. Again, not the answers. But as soon as you have the answer, yes, I have Buddha nature and I'm selfless. Well, the next moment, something will come up and knock on your senses and irritate you. There's this great haiku by Issa. He was this Japanese poet, And he said, all the time I'm praying to the Buddha, I'm swatting mosquitoes. So it's got it embraces the paradox of the big self and the small self, the holiness and the secular, that we tend to live very dualistically. And in a sense, it gets back to what I felt was being asked in the question period before, well, so who's sitting? And the problem with language. Meaning, as long as we keep using self, not self, as these two categories, they're going to be, irresolvable. We won't be able to bridge that gap. It's too wide a gap, self and non-self. What if they're two sides of the same coin, actually? What if it's the same reality? There's a teaching most of us are aware of, that samsara and nirvana are identical. And yet we tend to think that self and non-self are separate. What if self and non-self are actually the same thing? And non-self includes self, and self includes non-self. And what if my anger and irritation is actually an expression of non-self? So it's no longer proving that I'm stuck in self, but actually just part of this great reality. And yes, it may be harmful, I have to work on, but I can work on reality from a non-self point of view. Is that possible? So I want to look at the teaching of Master Dogen a little bit, because I think that's sort of the direction he's pointing us towards, is that self and non-self, emptiness and form, are not separate realities or separate realizations. They're actually the same thing. At the opening of the Genjo Koan, the first line says, all things are Buddha Dharma. Okay, so there's like the big statement, right? There's the Buddha nature. And then he goes on, there is delusion and realization, practice, birth and death. And there are Buddhas and sentient beings. Well, there's the unity. The world is Buddha nature. It is an enlightened world. And he also talks about practice enlightenment. We're not meditating and practicing and studying Buddha Dharma in order to get enlightened, because that's then saying I'm not, and there's somewhere I have to get to. But practice and enlightenment are one thing. You practice because it's an expression of your enlightened nature. It's not a way to achieve it. So here we see this also really non-dual vision of reality that Dogen is giving us. There's Buddha Dharma. Let's say there's the universe. And within this universe, there's all these things that seem to contradict, but in the Buddha Dharma, in the big universe, they're held together. Right? And that's the great emptiness, is that all things have its place. And we have to be really accurate when we talk about emptiness, because emptiness of self does not mean there's no self. Emptiness of self means there's no separate self from all the other things. So it's empty of this separate, normal, conventional way of thinking of it, but full of everything that we think is non-self. So where I end and you begin is not as definite. And we can just, do little thought experiments to clarify that. Like, I'm not separate from the air I'm sitting in, because if I turn up the heat and I get really hot, I'm going to get really uncomfortable. So my sense of self also includes air, which seems to me outside of my body. And I can go on and on to see how, as Michael was talking about, the elements. If you eat something spoiled, you'll know very quickly that you're connected to that material, right? And the other way around. So we see that just in terms of simple examples, how who and what we are extends our conventional notion. And what Dogen is suggesting here is that even birth and death, Buddhas and sentient beings, right, are part of the same enlightened reality called Buddha Dharma. So instead of wondering, how do I understand self and non-self, there's understanding everything as having its place. Everything in this great world called Buddha Dharma. And the next line he says, as the myriad things, that just means everything in the world, are without an abiding self. Okay, so there's the bottom line. There is no realization, no Buddha, no sentient beings, no birth and death. This is the denaming again. And you know that famous koan, if you see the Buddha kill him, is basically saying, don't get attached to forms and don't mistake the moon for the finger pointing at it. Don't mistake the words for the reality. And if everything is selfless, ultimately, right, then understand that these words are conventional labels. Right? And every time you use a word, understand it that way. That it's a conventional, useful label. It's an upaya, it's a skillful means. Can we use it skillfully? So we're going to adjust our relationship to language. We're going to clarify our relationship to language. How do we use right speech here? How do I use right language so that I'm not mistaking the moon for the word moon? That there is that experience, which in that wordless experience, there's no self. There's no enlightenment. There's no Buddha. There's nothing you can separate to say, what a wonderful meditation. Because as soon as you say that, you've separated the meditation from your experience of it. And if you want to do that, that's okay. Because that's also part of the great Buddha Dharma world. But just understand that now you're describing something in words, and your words talking about words. Right? Talking about words. So we want to sort of correct our relationship to words. And Basho, the great haiku poet, said that haiku is the process of correcting common speech. And I think it corrects common speech when it reminds us that speech is always metaphorical, right? No matter what. And we start confusing that and saying that our speech and our words are literal, and I'm describing myself the way I really am. And that's problematic. That's fixed and unchanging. It goes against that truth of, impermanence. And this is why he says next, the Buddha way is basically leaping clear of the many and the one. Thus there are birth and death, delusion and realization, sentient beings and Buddhas. The Buddha way is basically leaping clear of the many and the one. Okay? So, avoiding that dichotomy of self and not-self, of enlightened, unenlightened, knowing that they have conventional uses, they can be skillfully used, but it's not ultimate. So, avoid that mistake. And then you can have all this going on in the world. There's delusion and awareness. There's Buddhas and sentient beings. I want to read something from, just because it related very much to what Mayer had talked about and what Ross pointed out about self as activity. Because he has a chapter called Self as Undivided Activity. Right? So a sense of self, not as a name, not as a word, but as emotion, as Ross was saying. And he compares it, and this is also relevant to the metaphor used of the waves in the island. He uses the metaphor of a boat. So again, connecting us to water. Because birth is like riding in a boat. You raise the sails and row the oar. Although you row, the boat gives you a ride. And without the boat, no one could ride. But you ride in the boat, and your riding makes the boat what it is. Investigate such a moment as this. Right? Without the boat, there's no one riding the boat. Okay? Without this body, without this mind, without this thinking, there's no one thinking or moving in this body. We're looking for some essence. But when you just look at what's happening, then you're rowing the boat, or you're talking with your friend, or you're texting on your phone, and that's yourself. Right? And that's the rowing of the boat. And you take those away, and there's no essence of self that you can say, aha, myself is, just hidden. It's not hidden. It's obvious. It's all the time. It's whatever you're doing. And whatever you're thinking. And undivided activity. And that undivided activity, however, includes everything. That's the emptiness of the activity. So if we can understand that our activity is ourself, and that activity is not limited to the normal way of thinking of our activity. So if I think I'm rowing a boat and moving the oars, and I think, oh, myself is moving oars, rowing boat, that's not enough. That's not enough. That's halfway. Because he continues and he tells us, at just such a moment, there is nothing but the world of the boat. The sky, the water, and the shore are all the boat's world. When you ride in a boat, your body and mind and the environment together are the undivided activity of the boat. And I thought it was just rowing, that's enough. So, yeah, okay, I'm rowing right now. I'm rowing. Rowing right now. That's low enough. And, but he says, wait a second. What you thought was your activity goes a lot further. It's like that little metaphor of the butterfly that causes, an earthquake somewhere else. The butterfly wings. Well, here, as far as we can go, that's our world. And that world is your undivided activity. And your undivided activity is yourself. So if you really want to know who and what you are, start with what you're doing, expand it out as far as you can go, and then trace it back and answer the question, who am I? The entire earth and the entire sky are both the undivided activity of the boat. It's a big vision. It's a big vision. And at the end of that chapter, he says, know that there are innumerable beings in yourself. Also there is birth and there is death. So in this universal, undivided vision of a self, okay, we find everything that we thought was not self. And we actually know this, we can see this almost biologically. If you ever were to take a microscope and just look at a single hair, you'd be disgusted. Because you would find so many things on that hair crawling that, you'd never put your hair in your mouth again. Right? Don't even think about your skin. So, how about your intestines, if you want to go crazy? Now, there are innumerable beings, as he says, in yourself. And it's literal, but it also is including all of us and all the world as undivided activity. Where you end and something else begins is not so certain. So Suzuki Roshi has a book called Not Necessarily So. Not Necessarily So. So it's that kind of skeptical mind, or we could say great doubt. In Zen there are these pillars of understanding, and one of them is doubt. There's negative doubt, which is saying, I can't practice, I'm not strong enough, I can't do this, I'm not worthy enough, or I'm not enlightened. But then there's great doubt, which has the strength to ask the question, and the strength to say, the way I think I am, not necessarily so. Not necessarily so. That's great doubt, because it's liberating. It helps you. So every time you encounter self asserting itself in a limited way, there's nothing wrong with self being self, because that's just part of what it does. The brain thinks, the heart beats, the self sells. Yeah? But when it defines it as fixed and limited, then we start creating problems. So as it was said before in Mair's, we start getting defensive and creating walls and stuff like that. But if we can just relax and say, that's what it does. That's what it does. And it includes a lot more than I normally think. And this is why that not necessarily so is also a well-known attitude in Zen called beginner's mind, where we basically ask ourselves that question again and again. What's happening now? What is this activity now? What is it really, this activity? What is really happening now? How can I experience this without all the ideas, limitations, and walls around it that I normally use? So, this is where Dogen wrote. He said, ancient Buddha said, mountains are mountains, waters are waters. I referred to this before, but he takes it a different place. He said, he continues, these words do not mean mountains are mountains. They mean mountains are mountains. Okay, so there's the process. It's a sort of dialectic that we start with where we are, limited. Mountains are mountains. Daniel. I start to expand and I say, whoa, Daniel's so much non-Daniel. There's so much of me that I never thought was me, and maybe it's just my activity, or it's my emotion, or my feeling, or my thoughts. But even those thoughts are not me, because where's the self in the thought? So there's all this non-self that makes up self. So there we see the union of samsara nirvana, of self, non-self. Okay? Everything that I think is self is also at the same time not self. And then I can come back to self with a bit more of a, let's say, casual relationship. I don't have to be so stressed about the things I don't like about myself, because they're also not defining and they're not limited. They're transient. So we come back and we can accept ourselves as we are here and now, and just connect to this undivided activity. And understand that that activity, even though it may seem really small to you, like let's say, I don't know what, sweeping the floor, that undivided activity extends far beyond to include all things. You couldn't sweep the floor without the dust, and there wouldn't be dust if there weren't for the wind, and there wouldn't be the wind if it weren't for the sun and the heat and the oceans. This undivided activity, the whole earth and the whole skies are included in that. Dogen is always honoring the particular, and in the particular, the universal is found. So it's not an attempt here to transcend the self, but to return to the self with that universal perspective. I don't remember when I started.
It doesn't say it.
Does it? Can you tell me how much time I was?
זה חצי שעה בערך. זה חשוב.
I started at 12:20.
רואים פה את
I started at 12:20. Jeez. Really? I'm sorry, I went over time. My apologies. I didn't even get to what I wanted to do, but oh well. Thank you so much.